months now.
Go screw yourself.
I didn't quite hear that. Did you want to say it a little louder?
Go screw yourself.
Since Final Fantasy XIII's release in December 2009 in Japan, almost 12 years have passed. Yes, you heard it right. 12 years. And next March it's gonna be 12 years in the West. So not too long until this Final Fantasy is gonna be a teenager fitting its own name. I fondly remember the time that led up Final Fantasy XIII's release. Trailers were released as usual, but this time it would be different, because it would be teaming up with some other games following the same myth. The Fabula Nova Crystallis. Together with Final Fantasy Versus 13 and Agito, Square kept the fans excited with this new big project. Many people were eager to play this new game with the unknown prince, who later would turn out to be Noctis. The flashy CG scenes, especially with him walking around being all badass, summoning his weapons and wrecking the hell out of his enemies, was something that hyped up people for real. I also just as usual wanted to play it. However, since the settings play a big role in my general interest of a game, and I did not like several scenes like the big more realistic skyscrapers of what obviously was Insomnia, especially when it came to the pictures that were not showing the night time, and I also did not like the more traditional night-like enemies, I was so much more interested in the ordinarily titled main-numbered entry, Final Fantasy XIII itself. Agito barely interested me at all actually, even though I eventually picked up the reworked HD remaster Type 0, and it was actually pretty good in my opinion. None of that would matter for me in 2009 though. For me, only this really cool looking game with a lot more fantastic looking settings really piqued my interest. I was following the trailers and also looking at Lightning, who I totally loved, considering she looked like a female Cloud. Then I suddenly got introduced to the absolutely beautiful CG cutscene version of Vanille, and also what I consider to be the coolest designed Cid of all games, Cid Reigns. To this day I remember that I wrote under a YouTube video, "That's the coolest looking Cid ever," and judging by his design I even thought he might turn out to be the villain. Since I was the content manager of a Final Fantasy website in 2009, the webmaster gifted me a copy of Final Fantasy VII Advent Children Complete, which also contained the trial version, so the demo of Final Fantasy XIII. It also included trailers for Versus 13 and Agito. So the other Fabula Nova Crystallis entries, which at least somewhat interested me. Nonetheless, except for Advent Children Complete, I was primarily interested in Final Fantasy XIII. It was the game which eventually also featured such an incredible main theme in the trailers, Kimi ga Iru Kara, that I already considered it to possibly become one of my most favorite Final Fantasies ever. And when I played the demo, which was a beta version of Chapter 1, I got a very good first impression. Chapter 1 alone does not give you sufficient information to understand too much of the story, but you get your first gameplay experience. You start right within the action, just like it is the case with Final Fantasy VII, and so on. You might not understand much of what is going on, but much is going on, and that's for sure. I can still see myself making screenshots of it and writing a review post in the forum of the website I made content for. What I did not know back in the day were a few things that I will cover later in the video, but I was excited. Especially when I eventually found out the release date through a trailer presented by some smug guy where the camera would eventually pan out to reveal that he stood in the release date for the entire video. When I showed my brother that video, I talked with him about how negative so many fans were about old Final Fantasies, and how surely many will also find something to nag about this time, because in their eyes Final Fantasy had lost its touch since the fusion, or whatever else their excuse for their dislike was. little did I know that I was not too far off with my assumption. Then eventually December came around and I could finally import it. And yet, I still had to wait about 2 more weeks until I would get it. The criticism it received would not wait for so long, however. One has to be almost hopelessly naive to think Final Fantasy had never gotten criticism of such a big scale as Final Fantasy XIII received. Final Fantasy as a series is 35 years old by now, and the first real comparable criticism it received lays back 2 whole decades. Final Fantasy got really popular on the SNES, but was first widely accessible with Final Fantasy VII's release when even Europe got acquainted with the main installments. This was the time when, for many people, even to this day, the best Final Fantasies were released, and especially Europe got a very strong first impression, considering they never got a PAL version of the older entries until PS1 ports like Final Fantasy Origins, Anthology, the PS1 version of 6, and all the other hundreds of ports were released. The point is, people already had a very pre-established vision of what Final Fantasy had to look for them, and some regions even got introduced to it when that hype of a seemingly perfect Final Fantasy really hit its peak. I personally am from Germany, so the latter applies to me in particular. So there were many fans who, no matter how many Final Fantasies they knew by now, were used to a certain standard and even already so spoiled that they could not accept anything that did not really resemble it. And that was around the time when the first movie came out. You know, Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within. Square released really popular titles with 7, 8, and 9, and people were already waiting for 10, but of course they would also not miss out on the opportunity to watch the theatrical release of The Spirits Within. But the reception was disastrous. There was no fantastic, no super mature yet somewhat funny as well as very fairy tale-esque story. No anime trope characters, no chocobos, not even traditional monsters, no Sephiroth or Kefka, no Bahamut, Shiva or Ifrit, nothing. It was the story of Earth fending off an alien problem. That it actually shared a lot of elements with old Final Fantasies, and actually even some with newer ones, is something that seems to be overlooked, as in reality, The Spirits Within could hardly be any more of a Final Fantasy in its very essence. But that is a story for another day. As a side note, I belong to the crowd that was disappointed, but by now, I can appreciate it as an actually pretty solid movie that could probably take 30 to 45 more minutes of running time, but that will also be talked about in a separate video, as long as you actually want to hear about it. What was important was that people did not get what they wanted, and what happened was, they straight up hated the movie. The failure it turned out to be had consequences that would play a large role in Square changing forever. And yet this movie existed, and so did the backlash. Even to this day, people talk about the quality of Final Fantasy movies, and it all started here. Just as the first big criticism this franchise got started here. But wait, that is not how it ends. This kind of criticism would not hibernate until 2009. Final Fantasy X was really well received, and Square announced and released even more Final Fantasies, including more spin-offs, that would receive so much criticism that people's opinion of Final Fantasy would be highly affected. For the GameCube, Crystal Chronicles was released, and here once again people wondered what this game with a completely different style was supposed to be for them. When Final Fantasy X-2 came out, people did not want to hear that this game actually featured 2 paralleling emotional love stories and one of the most competent combat systems in the series. They just saw a Charlie's Angels game with a lot of side quests that did not have the same basic game structure they were used to, which turns out to be the superlinear game structure. And they already started to doubt that something good could come out from the recent fusion of Square and Enix. Which is funny, because only Final Fantasy X-2's Western release has Square Enix written on it, and it was actually still made and released during the Squaresoft era in Japan. And it would not stop there. Final Fantasy VII Advent Children got announced. There was the next problem. It was not just more of Final Fantasy when people felt let down. They also got more products of what many thought of as so good that any addition to it would be sacrilegious. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that many things they thought to be true, even though the original games actually already said otherwise, even more showed that the picture they painted for themselves got even more destroyed. And then the compilation was announced. It was a catastrophe for such people who just did not want to get such a product. Still, Final Fantasy as a brand was still so powerful that it kept its fanbase together. And then, after many spin-offs, GBA ports, and so much else, Final Fantasy XII of the Ivalice Alliance was released. There again, so many fans got something that, despite having a really rich and colorful world, abandoned a lot of what they liked so much. The representative protagonist had basically no role, since the real protagonist was the princess, Ashalia Bernard Nilmaska. The story was overly political, there was almost no humor in the game, except for Vaughn having an age joke, and they kept the humor very minimalistic. And overall, the facial expressions of the characters and the dialogue and even the eyes felt so soulless to many, supported by the fact that the characters could not even be bothered having colored irises, did not actually help Final Fantasy XII in making a strong case for being a worthy successor of the franchise. It also did not help that the game felt super sluggish in its vanilla version. I can recommend the interested ones to play the International Zodiac job system / Zodiac Age, though, because Final Fantasy XII is a game that really deserves being played at least once. And yet we had another game that would help people go on rants about what has become of their most precious RPG franchise. I remember one comment that just said, "I hate FF12," while having posted its DVD snapped in half. That is something I will never forget. So, you can see, it wasn't just Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy received so much harsh criticism that even with Final Fantasy XIII having been released eventually, the mere treatment of it being such a joke of a game for the franchise requires one to either not know how many people behaved before its time, ignore that fact, or to just not be honest in the first place about it. If you actually bother to watch the entire video, you will realize that I do indeed not defend Final Fantasy XIII from legitimate criticism. Doing so would be nonsensical. Even this section alone will point that out very clearly. Nevertheless, having witnessed so many people express their opinion about Final Fantasy XIII, I cannot take most of the negative comments seriously when it comes to considering them as legitimate, as I have watched so many of them for the last 12 years, and so many of them came from a bias that I just cannot believe, to not having influenced so many players for a great deal. For that, the reactions and the situations were just not appropriate enough. And I confidently say that because I have seen it from the moment the game came out in Japan, and Westerners that did not even have the game already started talking about how bad the game was. There is one important factor that basically cements my statement as at least truthful to an extent, and it has nothing to do with Final Fantasy at all. It is the simple fact of being a human being. Humans can never be fully and totally objective, and will always have their biases. but for many it is very hard to really try to confront a new experience as neutral as possible, and you can be sure that most of the time when someone says they do not get influenced by their own biases or by what others say, it is a whole lot of bullcrap, because that is not how we are built, and such a person flat out does not exist. I myself also know that I do not work like that, but that is exactly what is important. This honesty towards yourself can help you to at least give your best in such a difficult task of being more neutral, less influenced by others, etc. Especially your own biases can help you getting less influenced by others, so you see this is getting a lot more complex, but then we have the problem once again that it is a bias and therefore drifting away from neutrality. So you see, the only thing you can do is embrace your imperfection and try to be less influenced, while being aware that you will never be 100% objective, and that there will never be any circumstances where you won't be manipulated by your own environment or peers. There are many examples, both recent as well as older in fiction, where exactly that happened. Not always in the same situation, but it all originates from the same source. And this goes far beyond mere fiction, actually. You might also end up no longer ignoring things from certain people, even though you turned a blind eye on a detail before, or would have had some kind of excuse for it, while really being convinced that it is not just an excuse. It just happens all the time. So naturally the same applies to Final Fantasy XIII as well. Now let's travel back to December 2009. The game was yet to be released globally, and yet articles and threads were popping up talking about it. I will never in my life forget how I opened the Final Fantasy thread of a TCG forum that I was a member of, and I saw them going on a rant about the game that I was anticipating so much. They linked to an article named Final Fantasy XIII is as linear as a piece of string, featuring some of the infamous maps and continuing to talk about it in the thread and going on a rant about how bad it was. I was in shock. They did not even play this game, and yet they were already so aggressively talking about it. Now, ironically, I was still waiting for the game and could not properly defend it from the perspective of someone who had played it, but that did not matter to me. Prematurely crapping on a game and ruining your own mood based on one single game design element was something that did not justify such hard posts in my eyes. So what I did was that I started talking a lot about the natural linearity of Final Fantasy, or many Final Fantasy games, and that even Final Fantasy X had an arrow showing you the way, furthermore pointing out that it was not necessarily something new, but also definitely not something that automatically is a deal breaker. But the seeds were already planted for many people. Many read or heard that stuff, and over the first weeks and months even more heard it. And that is one of the main problems that I was just talking about. If you confront a new experience with a really miserable mindset, then it is very likely that it will guide you through that experience and corrupt your own perception. Suddenly something that I consider as legitimate criticism becomes not so legitimate at all, because it is doubtful if it really was your honest opinion, or if you just spiraled yourself so much down the "oh, it is gonna be crap anyways, oh look, this is crap and that is crap" path. And that is going to infect other people as well. If I'm completely honest, I wanted to approach Final Fantasy XIII with a positive mindset, but having made the mistake of engaging in such discussions, every joyous moment of the game was tainted for me because it was followed up with a little internet guy whispering, "Oh, but this is linear as a piece of string, and therefore it is bad," even though I did not find the game bad at all. And yet that claim planted some kind of expectation in my mind where I am sure, without having read such threads, I would not even have bothered, or at least not so much, as I just did not attribute that much value to such things. But such intense discussions planted it in my mindset, and it kept haunting me, even though I would have probably only slightly missed it without those rants. That is the thing that I will always associate Final Fantasy XIII with. Because that early toxicity, that premature ranting, poisoning your own mindset, and as said before, that doesn't just happen with Final Fantasy XIII, but this kind of behavior is something that kept haunting even me. Even though there was so much about the game that I loved. And I will forever be sad about that. Now, I can gladly say that Final Fantasy XIII still offered me so much that the overall experience always will be a great and good memory for me. But it is just a fact that this game got an unfair treatment from the start, and that poisoning of minds by setting bad expectations prevailed for a long time. And as a matter of fact, still prevails, just like it does with everything else, certain books, movies, and so on. I'm sure everyone can think of certain examples. The mere fact that I explain this very human behavior and that it results in not necessarily the fairest treatment, and that then some people in forums or comment sections denied that over the years, even though, as mentioned, it is in the human nature as well as was I literally there to witness it, is just one more example for why this actually makes sense, and that Final Fantasy XIII's criticism was not always that legitimate. As said, there are people who legitimately dislike it, but people who prematurely got their mindset corrupted. Very often I cannot take seriously with their incredible rage, and very often you just notice that the comments that they post, or when we're not talking about the internet and they just discuss something about Final Fantasy in real life, those are the kinds of people that never really gave Final Fantasy XIII a proper chance to begin with. So maybe whenever you like or dislike something, just at least sometimes ask yourself if your mindset really led to such a fair judgment. If you really bother doing so, you might notice how often one should do that in other areas of life as well. If a person denies that he or she can be dishonest or hypocritical, and finds excuses for everything while also being super convinced of them, that might not be the best sign. So yes, it absolutely is possible to dislike many things about Final Fantasy XIII, but it's also very easy for the situation leading up to it to influence you in a way that even you yourself might not desire. Now to the real meat and potatoes. Final Fantasy XIII itself is not any less of a pioneer than its predecessors. Whether you like it or not, it is nearly impossible to deny the ambition that went into its project. That is also exactly what led to the decisions that ultimately represented its downfall. To this day, it is known and praised for many things. It was built with Square's own in-house engine, the White Engine, or as it later was called, the Crystal Tools. As usual, they did not shy away from any expenses when it came to living up to their name of being an absolutely incredible game developer that makes beautiful looking games that are just ahead of their time. And seeing the myth of the Fabula Nova Crystallis, they were also very confident and dedicated to once more put high effort into delivering fairy tales that we should not forget so quickly. Even Uematsu-san, who was by then already known as a composer legend, had a more than worthy successor with Hamauzu-san, as even nowadays many of those who did not really like the game very highly praise its soundtrack. The problem with its ambition was that Final Fantasy XIII never was supposed to be what people expected. And this leads us back to the old Spirits Within, Crystal Chronicles, and so on story. Final Fantasy XIII was supposed to focus more on what was deemed more relevant, and that was its storytelling and presentation. And they went so far with that the sacrifices they made ended up as just too restrictive for the old school player, as well as made it cause some bigger confusions for some, because they felt overwhelmed with the lore, which is not necessarily a problem of quantity, but of pacing and proper placement. So there definitely was room for improvement, and this might ironically already have been solved through the mere addition of room to breathe in the chapters. Normally I do not criticize the pacing of Final Fantasy XIII in particular, especially as I do not have too much of a problem with its story, but in reality the pacing is definitely something that could be responsible for being off-putting to people. I'm also pretty sure that hardly anyone knows that we'd been warned what Final Fantasy XIII would turn out to be 7 months prior to the game's release. Kitase-san back in the day announced in an interview that the game would not be an ordinary JRPG, but a so-called genre straddler. Now, I personally did not know that, and stumbled over it by coincidence years later. But I know it would have definitely prepared some people, me included, to rearrange some expectations. That doesn't mean one could not be mad that it did not turn out to be a proper JRPG, especially considering much of it still is actually JRPG-esque, so the statement is a bit weird anyway, but it could definitely have helped us to get used to the thought and to approach it a bit more prepared. This is something that I will also criticize in the later sections of the video, while suggesting how it could have turned out differently. Anyway, while I primarily want to talk about Final Fantasy XIII itself, the mere existence and way its sequels were approached put even more emphasis on Square not just still being the incredible developer it was known for before Final Fantasy XIII, but also that they actually care a lot. This manifested also in the way of how the criticism was received. Final Fantasy XIII-2 and XIII-3, so Lightning Returns, were approached in a way that showed they took the demands of their fans seriously while still pulling through their own thing. There were still things to be desired, and in all actuality the fear of the criticism XIII received clearly bled into Final Fantasy XV's making, as it could absolutely be felt, which was not necessarily a good thing, as suddenly a lot of substance was given up for the mere option of having a more light-hearted journey in an almost too simple world. And no, I'm not talking about the myth that surrounds the world of Final Fantasy XV. And this is a clear downside of letting yourself get too influenced by the demands of your consumers. In all fairness though, even in 15 they took a lot of its criticism seriously, and later added a lot of elements that were asked for. I still think they left out the most fundamental things to feel engaged in the story, and that will always give me a feeling of 15 being incomplete, but I do not want to drift off too far here. The point is, they clearly care, and a deficit in communication does not always lead to adding the things that people want to be included to get truly invested. So what is it exactly that we have with Final Fantasy XIII? We have a game that came out after the Japanese release of its novella, Episode 0, Promise. For many people, that alone is a red flag, as they do not really like how supplemental material features extra information, or maybe even a really important one. However, while Episode 0 indeed gives more insight and context, Final Fantasy XIII solved that in a fairly clever manner, as the really important bits are basically parts of the flashbacks featured in the game itself. I think it could have been a bit better, as there were moments in the book that the player should just have seen, such as the moment of when Lightning and Sarah lost their mother, and how Lightning swore on her mother's grave to be there for her sister, ultimately abandoning her own childhood and becoming Lightning, or the mere fact that the book gives more context about how Hope is a lot closer to his mother because he misinterprets the relationship with his father, but at least the latter one got a glimpse in the game in Palom. It is just very sad because those scenes would have shed some light on the characters and made them even more human, and maybe even more likable to some. Lightning was criticized for her absence of emotions most of the time, which is not even true, because most of the time she's just a very grumpy person. And when it comes to Sarah, she can be more joyful, but still she is emotionally very distanced. And with Lightning Returns having Lumina, people started criticizing the developers for Lumina being a late excuse for Lightning's more cold representation. This is one of those things that people would not have necessarily thought if they were just provided with such scenes that, from the get-go, said, "Hey guys, there is a reason for why Lightning behaves so much like characters like Cloud and Squall." Same goes for Hope. If people just knew it beforehand, the scene when Hope's father surprised him saying, "You're my son, this is your home," might have had a different impact, because the game alone might not give a strong enough impression of what Hope really thinks the relationship between him and his father is like. And of course, it would also have highlighted even more why Hope is so devastated about the loss of Nora, but that, I guess, would just be an extra facet, because it is more than normal to be destroyed when your parent dies. Overall, this is something the story definitely could have made to reel in its audience even more, but it is not really deniable that the thought that was put into its exposition was already very admirable, especially how each individual character from the main cast and their overall feelings and interactions with the others, so the group's dynamics, are very well presented. If you ask me, while Final Fantasy VII is my most favorite game of all time, 13 is the one with the best main cast, because I think they were handled just so well and with such consideration of you getting to know them and how they work as human beings, that no other Final Fantasy for me comes close to that. Yes, I like my Cloud, Aerith, Auron, Yuna, Garnet, Terra, etc. more than other individual characters like Vanille, Sass, or Hope, but I just happen to dislike the cast of those Final Fantasies a lot more because characters that are just not interesting enough to me, or even considerably irrelevant, drag down the entire cast for me. Of course, I'm aware that something similar happened to many that played 13, because they, for example, hate Hope, and I can understand that. People just do not like certain things. But I think in Hope's case, him being annoying and him being childish is as perfect as can be. The boy has a troubled family and a strong connection to his mother, and then from one moment to the next he loses her. And that happens in an incident where he sees her following Snow. Yes, it wasn't directly Snow's fault, but again, he lost a beloved one, and even more important, he is a very young teenager that is in the middle of developing a personality. I see people in their 20s or 30s and so on that behave more immature, and when it comes to such an emotional moment, it actually is even more natural to be like that, even if it might not be the absolute smartest way to act. Practically every member of the cast receives criticism of such sort, and I get that. But I think given the situations they are presented in, it is just understandable how they react according to their own given characteristics. If it feels organic to me, that is a good thing. Now, of course, it can still be annoying, but here for me it was just not the case, because the cast itself just worked too well and turned out to be very likable. When I saw Snow in the first screenshots, I thought, oh well, this guy seems to be some sort of scoundrel. Then he turned out to be one of my most favorite characters. Sure, he's portrayed fairly one-note with his heroism, but it shows that he is a genuinely good guy and just really wants to help his fiancée his own way. Also, he's a very honorable person because being accepted by Lightning and having her approval means a lot to him. Snow is presented like Lightning, Sass, Vanille, Hope, and Fang. Those characters absolutely give their all for the people they care about. when it comes to the villain's representation of Final Fantasy XIII, I also really like that it goes a different route. Featuring the evil government is something that many Final Fantasies or many RPGs in general do, but Final Fantasy XIII liked to actually do something new with it. And that 20 years after the first, so the original Final Fantasy game came out, and certain tropes for Final Fantasy itself were established over the years when the other entries came out. And what exactly do I mean by that? Well, it featured Galenth Daisley, or to be more precise, Barthandelus, Bartuanderus. Once when I mentioned that I like Daisley because he's very different, some guy just tried to hand-wave it away with, well, yeah, he's different in that he's old. But that is nothing to ignore, actually. Final Fantasy always had evil leader characters, but what did they look like? Emperor Matthias Palamachia, and yes, his name is Palamachia and not Palamecia, is just another anime character. Rufus is just another anime character. Vaincardia Solidor is just another anime character. Yes, there were older looking leaders like Emperor Gestal, or Gastora as he's called in Japanese, Maester Maika, and later Emperor Aldecapt, but none of them had the same weight in the story and maybe even turned out to play the second fiddle next to who truly turned out to be the villain, if they even were considerable villains at all. Final Fantasy XIII took that concept and threw it away. The main villain was flat out an Emperor Palpatine type of character. No pretty anime character or anything. Just an old slimy guy that did fit his position and still was very appealing as a villain. Even the fact that he used the heroes was very well pulled off. That is also not anything new because Sephiroth used Cloud, Kuja used the party, and so on, but they did a pretty solid job with establishing another puppet master. Even the display of cruelty did not fall short. The moment when he had a grip of Fang and both healed her as well as tortured her again and again showed what a swine this villain could be. That, of course, was the case during the final battle, when he was in his fused orphan form. It really fits well together. And with the actually very classic plot of Final Fantasy and generally how role-playing games feature heroes that do not just oppose a divine threat, but are also faced with the dilemma of being used while actively struggling against being used. And at the same time, it brought a new spin to it. However, entities like Daisley were also a reason for many people to be turned off, and I'm not speaking about his incredible beauty. The game itself has so much lore that people just had no idea what was going on. I do personally not think that is too much of a problem, because there are so many random terms in every Final Fantasy, and even the slightest explanation at the beginning only gives some brief insight, as well as having no problem with it because I basically use all of my first playthroughs only to get to know the game and its basic and most important story, while getting to understand everything in subsequent playthroughs, if there is more to it. But the fact of the matter is, many people were confused by it, and the fact they felt obligated to look up the in-between summaries, which I never felt as too necessary, still shows a different approach might have been better. Surely, the inclusion of completely random terms like Fal'Cie, Xiii, and Cie'th did not do Final Fantasy XIII a favor the same way easy and familiar words like soldier, seed, and garden did, which is a shame because the overall ideas are actually quite creative and interesting. Having some biomechanical godlike creatures, the Fal'Cie, and as it is revealed, then actual gods next to them, definitely paints this universe's myth in its own colors, you could say. And while mentioning them, I can finally come to one of the most important points when it comes to the decision of how Final Fantasy XIII was designed. Despite seeming so fantastical, much sense of realism went into the making of Final Fantasy XIII. In certain areas a lot more than it is the case with other Final Fantasies, and that furthermore restricted a lot of what it could have been, unfortunately. I will also point out certain possible solutions for that in the next chapter of the video. You will notice that I'm gonna make this promise a few times, actually. Regarding the realism, Square really tried to make this influence a lot of the game itself, even things that might not seem so obvious. And this already begins with their weapons. Final Fantasy doesn't exactly make a big fuss about how much the characters cared when it comes to running around with big weapons. Some weapons get summoned, such as Masamune, and in Advent Children they tried to find a workaround for people like Cloud and Barret, but not every Final Fantasy world ignores the problem of characters running around with inconvenient weapons. 13 solved it pretty appropriately. The weapons that would be fairly impractical to carry around were actually foldable. While Snow and Sass do not have that problem, Lightning, Vanille, Hope, Fang, and later also Sarah in 13.2 got a smarter design for their weapons that would also correspond with the more technologically advanced side of 13. Not needing to run around with a weapon that is super inconvenient and also fairly weird for the character to do so is something that also influenced the Final Fantasy VII remake. If you pay attention to Aerith, and maybe even look at it in slow motion, you will notice that she actually folds her staffs before she puts them away. Of course, Final Fantasy XV did the complete opposite thing and just pulled off a Houdini whenever the weapons are needed or no longer needed. But I think for the game that 13 is, it is very fitting and a really nice attention to detail when it comes to really considering how the characters have to run around all the time and what is convenient, what is inconvenient, and how they would realistically solve it. Of course, the inclusion of save points and treasure chests is also something that follows the same concept of making everything look purposeful and organically integrated in a way that would seem natural for the game. What weird looking shiny spots or save crystals or Moodles did before was now done with a highly advanced computer terminal, just as the treasure chests were no longer classic chests that might look weird in the area but actually floating spheres. Granted, Final Fantasy VII, for example, did not just have its golden chests, but also wooden boxes or white bags, and they definitely could have done that here as well. But I welcome a new and fitting design which actually looks like it belongs in that world instead of some random medieval looking treasure chests. Although naturally they could also have gone for that design if they just went for, well, a different design of chests. The remake of 7, for example, went for a more Crisis Core-like and also modern design, which I ironically did not like that much because I'm just so used to the original Final Fantasy VII treasure chests. And yet for 13, such a design would have been fine. But the idea they went with was not any less fitting, and definitely something new. Looking at it isolated, it might seem silly to praise such a thing, but I really think all those small details that show how well thought out these things were, and still are, just so they would seem more believable together, while also showing that those designs are completely unconventional for the old school player, is something that deserves praise in my eyes, as it is all part of the care that I previously mentioned, which was put into making this game. It is very often incredible how much time for attention to detail, together with making pieces fit together, is put into making a game, and this game is not any less of an example for it. Now, don't worry if you're weirded out by the fact that I praise such things like treasure chests so much. Even Final Fantasy XIII has its limits of this realism and organic inclusion, as I call it. And I also have some criticism for these things later in the video. So, as I mentioned it previously, that's the next promise that I will cover that also in the next section of the video. But it will be quite a while until then. For now, we can go even further with that realism. Since Final Fantasy XIII tries to not appear as if the characters can run around wherever they want, as they are considered criminals, they kept their stay in populated areas and interactions with other people to a minimum. Just as the option to go shopping via computer seems to be a more realistic option then. However, this only gets a pass for me personally when it really just comes to believability, as I just as many other people really missed such options. I really did. So this was one of the double-edged swords in its design. It helped making it more believable and definitely was convenient for the player to always have access to shops, but no real town exploration, finding shops that reminded you of the good old times, and at least finding some people to talk to, no matter how insignificant it might have been, is just something that many people actually desired and missed. And I can absolutely understand that, and I feel the same way. I think they could have found a way to provide the player with such options and made it fit the themes of the game, with it actually having substance. Same goes for the idea that because Pulse is a wild planet, a bewildered planet, you're not really supposed to meet anyone and get overwhelmed by the scenery that is supposed to be ruled by wildlife and nothing else. Much of this paragraph is actually something that I do not completely agree with when it comes to how it was handled, as you can see, even though there is meaning to it. But as mentioned before, I will suggest some ideas of improvement later. The last bit that I want to cover when it comes to how they tried to make a fantasy world more realistic despite having monsters and inhuman entities is that simply everything that you would know from other games, like weapons and other elements, as mentioned, like monsters or magic or such things, are actually not shown to be normal for that world and the characters they live in. I just mentioned the monsters. So let's get to the monsters first. In Final Fantasy is a completely casual thing to leave a town and then find a monster around the next corner. Games like 8 and 10 also made an effort by explaining that they are either aliens dropping from the moon, or manifestations of deceased life forms that just did not move on. That is already a good attempt, and yet it is still just monsters running around everywhere. 13, on the other hand, makes it very clear that people on Cocoon are not used to monsters at all. There are artificially created creatures and also actual ones in very isolated areas, but they never bothered having a farm next to a big swamp full of monster cobras like 7. Even the Cie'th, which they used to represent the undead monsters, have their very own meaning and do not randomly pop up. People on Cocoon just do not need to live under such conditions, as the monsters normally are from Pulse itself, and of course it also at the same time shows how much their lives were controlled by the Fal'Cie. And it also does not stop at the monsters. Magic is no different. What certain Final Fantasies tackled like 6, 7 and 8, and the way how they tackled that topic by mentioning that magic was either a dead thing from ancient times, or the result of your body and the planet reacting to each other, so the powers of the planet are manifested in magical form, or also something artificial. All those attempts of bringing in an actual explanation were very admirable. Final Fantasy XIII also makes it very clear that for the people that exist there, magic is simply something that could not be any further from normal, and that it is not really a thing in their life. They go even further by weaving it into the story in a really meaningful way by making it a gift that the Xiii are capable of using, because they were branded by one of the supernatural entities, driving home even more the point that these guys are potentially dangerous to the common folk and just interacting with their surroundings in a way that is not accepted by the laws of Cocoon. Final Fantasy VII has a very big backstory with a live stream, the Cetra and the origins of magic, and even goes with its expansions, the lore of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, the extra mile of explaining that using materia is actually also a fairly bad thing for the planet itself, so there are various attempts of bringing in those surreal elements and give them at least some meaning. And Final Fantasy XIII really is not any worse here. I think the fact that they show it as just something people are actually not used to, and even fear as a supernatural or unnatural thing, adds an extra layer to what is represented as truly realistic. Now, of course, things do not always need to contain full-on realism, and as we all know, it would be ridiculous to say Final Fantasy actually is realistic. But for their worlds, I think whenever they do such a thing, here for magic in particular, they do a pretty good job. It is not all that necessary for me, but I applaud their effort. I think the way the demons in 15 were explained, for example, was also fine. And I'm also not mad if items are picked up as shiny little dots, but it is nice when everything fits so great together. And these things are what I really like and think about when it comes to certain restrictions in the game that are actually criticized. An obvious thought went into how weapons are handled, why characters are low profile except when they really want to purposely make a show like Snow did, what magic is, and so on. That does not mean that it does not have any downsides for me, but I can at least appreciate that there was a good enough reasoning, even if I would have wanted it to be different. The second to last portion of this video section is regarding the combat system. This is one of the most polarizing aspects of the game, and maybe even represents the game even better because of that than the word people associate Final Fantasy XIII with most of the time. Final Fantasy XIII absolutely does its best to give you exciting and dynamic battles. Both visually and from its mere feeling, it might be the best to call it an evolution from Final Fantasy X-2's combat system. In both, you have your turn-based combat in an extra combat zone. However, the decisions that were made when it was created turned out to be more than a double-edged sword, it seems. You have your turn bar charging for you until you decide to spend one for a single move or string together multiple. Since the battles are extremely fast-paced, you have to be constantly on the edge of your seat, paying attention to what your enemy does just so you can properly respond. If you decide to not change to a defensive stance in time, even the seemingly easier enemies can wipe the floor with you quickly. On the other hand, the basic principle of your offensive strategy is mostly really simple. And I mean really simple. Mostly you are supposed to fill up the break or stagger bar of the enemy, which often makes it more vulnerable and also serves as a multiplier for the damage you deal. You will find yourself using a lot of the physical attacker optima, maintaining the percentage with a few strikes while filling it up more using the spellcaster role, the blaster optima. For those who have no idea what I'm talking about, you probably know the optima as the job class system, which then was renamed to Paradigm. I'm used to saying both. Even the job classes do not have all the same names, but I'm pretty sure you know what I'm talking about, whether I use words like medic or healer. Now, while you have to rotate between the classes, you already have a very strategic concept of how to behave in combat. The problem many see is that the battle system has a certain repetitiveness and automation to it. It is true that most battles are best approached with the steps of breaking the enemy's stamina and then attacking full force, while occasionally healing or casting your protection or deprotection spells. I do not think this is the fairest of all criticisms, though, because many RPG battles in their essence can be broken down to such a simple concept that has to be followed. I just wanted to recommend games like Sekiro if you want to have something with actual complexity in its battles, and then I remembered that even such games have the basic concept of depleting the enemy's stamina through perfect parries, or a combination of that as well as chipping away damage, or, well, chipping away life points, that overall makes it harder for the enemy to recover. Now, while most will agree that Sekiro is a harder game to learn, you can see that the concept always can be dumbed down, because that is exactly how those games are made. You are not supposed to have them be scientifically challenging, as a mortal should be able to get through them. Maybe a better example of something very complex is the fighting game scene nowadays. They are really complex, with people knowing each and every frame of a move, and when they should chain together certain inputs to an almost ridiculous extent. And yet, if you think about it, even that are just the mechanics. The concept of what you have to do to reach the common goal, so to beat the enemy, is still very obvious. Sure, it is harder to reach it against someone who makes a science out of the game, but the concept itself is easy nonetheless. Having a hard to understand winning condition and making it even harder to pull that off makes you lose your audience, so I do not see any reason for why Final Fantasy XIII has to be any more complex than reduce the enemy's HP to 0, and most of the time it is best to do that by staggering the enemy. I think it is more than enough, and just as usual, people tend to exaggerate. The other thing that is often really disliked is what people summarize as press X to win. And with that, they do not just mean that you have to confirm your actions, but that you basically have to make no decisions at all. I do not know how long people that say that have played Final Fantasy XIII, but the claim that this is all you need to do to win is ludicrous. It is 100% true that the game in advance decides which moves you can use, or should use to be more precise. But first of all, you are not forced to do that, so that argument already falls flat, and second, you still have to shift your paradigms. People that criticize it acknowledge the paradigms very often, yet still try to over-exaggerate the automation argument, but that makes no actual sense, as paying attention and the constant shifting is a major part of what the battles consist of. Sometimes it is even better to actually choose certain things by yourself. I, for example, very often use potions combined with the doctor's code, because later the amount of hit points that are healed with potions scale, and the fact that you can instantaneously heal with items instead of waiting and without being stuck in the healer paradigm just makes the battle more efficient for me this way. Sometimes when I really need some big heals, I still shift to the healer, but that is the entire point. It already shows that in certain situations you can very much profit from taking things in your own hands. There are many possibilities, and I would not actually want to criticize a game for an automation method that does not need to be used, especially when people actually end up using it, so it still has to be something they acknowledge as good enough. Actually, I cannot stress this enough, but Final Fantasy battles later always get very repetitive. At first you start with experimenting a bit, and then you find yourself spamming the same quick hits in Final Fantasy X, or using Squall's Rensokken, Irvine's Shot, or other limit breaks, overdrives, or overall characters which have a certain move that you just do not want to waste other space in your party for. Now, one design choice that I can agree with that should have been reconsidered was the decision to make the party's leader's health the game over criteria in battle. Final Fantasy XIII 2 acknowledged that this was a big problem for many and changed that. Generally, the idea of having your controlled character be knocked out and then losing the battle is not necessarily the worst thing. The problem is that despite me saying how fast-paced battles are, very often the overall duration of them is still too long. You and your enemies might act pretty quickly, but so often your enemies have too many hit points, and that lengthens the battle, which can be a problem in and on itself already, but then being forced to repeat that just because your leader was KO'd is a real gut punch. This is something where the relatively easy way to build up the stagger and everything else that belongs to that is at least a relief though, as you will not really find yourself repeating something that was nearly impossible to overcome. Now back to the leader argument for a moment. I can understand that you only have the leader, as the battles are, when it comes to the mere motion, just so hasty, but not only could they have removed the leader gets KO'd means game over rule, they could also have made it the way 13.2 handled it, by you being able to switch characters. Sure, you still would not be able to really control more than one, not that this is the only Final Fantasy where that ever happened, but you would at least give the players more options, and if you do not go for that way, you could at least have something where your party members can slightly be influenced in their decisions. Not necessarily as complex as the Gambits, which, by the way, was very beloved in Final Fantasy XII, and guess what? It was automation pure, which I also never went for, but they still could have found some middle ground. Overall, despite these points existing, I think the combat system is more of a good thing than a bad one, because its focus on being stylish and keeping you busy is something I can very much appreciate. And being kept busy in many other regards, ironically, is something that so many miss in this game. So at least the combat is not like that at all, even though I absolutely can admit that I'm not the biggest fan of how long some of those battles are. Now we are still in the same section of the video, so how could I end it any better than with a word that Final Fantasy XIII is infamously attributed with: linearity. The word that Final Fantasy XIII got so much hate for, and for which fans alone already have different meanings when it comes to the game itself. Whenever somebody speaks about the linearity within Final Fantasy XIII, the first thing that comes to one's mind most of the time is the literal level design. Hallways or corridors are terms that are often used for it. And it is true that Final Fantasy XIII has a certain amount of fairly narrow paths. Occasionally they lead off to a short branch for an additional treasure chest, but you still won't be able to go on an expedition when doing so. Claiming that Final Fantasy XIII only consists of such maps alone will be highly over-exaggerated though. In the second chapter alone, it already gives the player a map with some broader platforms. The third chapter, after a fairly narrow start, has some broader spaces outside and a temple area with some bigger spaces, and so on. This exists in multiple of the more seemingly visually imprisoning areas, and of course in areas like on Pulse, or later on Eden, and in the final stage as well as in the Nautilus Park, you have less restrictions in your movement. That, however, is unfortunately just one mere facet of the linearity, and the others cannot be hand-waved away. It is not just that the game very often is stingy with where you can go, but also with what you can do. I'm talking about the linearity of your actions beyond simple movement. And it will also combine that with a narrative focus, because that is what influenced all of those facets anyway. Final Fantasy XIII narrows down the player's own freedom that for so many it feels like there isn't any at all. This feeling gets especially strong when you literally walk down some of the more narrow paths, and a few teams of enemies and maybe one or two treasure chests are what separate you from the next cutscene. This can be good because you can be sure to get engaged in the story that they first want to tell, but the idea can absolutely backfire as you take a very big risk of making the player lose interest. Many people, whenever Final Fantasy XIII is defended, use exactly this narrative necessity for why everything is so linear, and then they say you can do more things later. And that is correct. The problem is making your consumer feel uninterested or simply not entertained is one of the worst things a product can do. I think the storytelling is more than worthy to serve as hook, but I get that sometimes people just want to do something different, and I also think of it as a bit of a disappointment, that indeed you cannot just do that for 10 or 15 minutes in the middle of a chapter if you think now you want to take a break from, well, what comes next, so the next battle or the next cutscene. While the world, the story, and the game might not be familiar to someone for the first time, the structure itself becomes very predictable, and the steps get very repetitive to go through. This repetition happens in RPGs all the time, but in a lot of cases other games just mask it more, which for some reason is just enough to trick us and keep us excited. It doesn't work always, but still very often. Having many enemies in your way is something Final Fantasy XIII also does in a way that does not work often enough, and that starts with them being visible to the player. If you walk down a path and you have a map with an arrow, which I do not necessarily think of as a bad thing because Final Fantasy X has it as well. Also, you can turn off the map, which I definitely recommend at least sometimes, as it is a completely different feeling. And if said path is already fairly narrow, and you are presented with a line of enemies that are like the breadcrumbs on that path, breadcrumbs which you do not really need, mind you, it just highlights how little space you have to navigate. And I do not even mean the fact that often enemies cannot be avoided, but that is one factor that plays a role for many as well. I think this is not the worst thing, because while casually playing the game you need the points you receive, and also often you can still outmaneuver an enemy or sneak past them and get the item you want or just make some progress. And yet I think the way this was designed was a very big flaw that could have been avoided easily. Areas like Pulse prove that as well, but then we get to the same old song of how it was often done on purpose early in the game, ultimately leading us nowhere with those thoughts. As opposed to Final Fantasy XIII, which most definitely leads us to where it wants us to be. In the end, this, and I do not mean the way monsters were placed, is something that can absolutely be beneficial, but alienating your fan base and taking the risk of the player losing interest because sometimes you just want to do something different and just activating a switch sometimes or hope riding a juggernaut machine is one risk that just does not need to be taken. There are people who feel rewarded enough with a story and by being able to just look at this very imaginative world, but if the feeling to do something else comes up, that is troublesome. And as much as I love the story and the way this world was designed, I also sometimes would have liked to just do something different. For me personally, the very fact that I love it so much and how it looks is the very reason why I am often so sad and disappointed that you cannot do more with it and interact more with it. It angers many people, but sadness and sometimes disappointment is the right word for me, other than with Final Fantasy XV, for example, where several things missing actually are angering to me. It is also questionable to expect from the player that doesn't feel engaged to sit out the parts that might appear dull, just to be rewarded later. The old "wait, it gets really good later on" is just something you should not force a consumer to bear with. As mentioned before, I love the story enough, so there is no need for me to bear with it. But there are people who are a lot less interested in it, and who want to be able to have more explorative and interactive experience. Which I can understand, and at least to an extent also am missing in the game. I just happen to think it is no game breaker, since what actually exists is more than just good enough, but as teased multiple times by now, I very much intend to make some suggestions of how this game could have been improved. But at first I want to mention one example of what is in the game and take an in-depth look at how it possibly disturbed the joy of someone playing this game. And this example is the 5th arc. The 5th arc starts off as fairly promising. You are just past a major story revelation, and since your character is a reunion in the last chapter, this is the first time you will be able to use the team you want in a more free manner. What do I mean with that? Well, the story cools off for a bit, and you have some fairly big areas in the arc with a good chunk of different paths you can go with more than enough battles that you do not necessarily need to fight or can outmaneuver if you do not want to fight. Of course, if you want to use your team, you are gonna have to fight. But the point is, this chapter already starts to feel a lot more off rails, even though it very much is on rails. And yet even story-wise, there are only a few scenes in this chapter. Sounds good so far, I would say. There is only one problem. Once again, it is about what you cannot do. If you pay attention to the areas in the arc, you will see there are big enough spaces to maneuver, and it absolutely gives you the chance to explore. And yet, there is no meaning to that, because while this is one of the less restrictive chapters, you cannot really do anything. It is very similar to the Nautilus chapter, where Saz and Vanille for the first half do not need to fight at all, and the only thing they do for a 2-minute section is look for Chocolina, Saz's chocobo chick. This chapter, I think, is even worse in its design because it literally throws you into an amusement park. You can take a breather and you cannot do a thing. It is like this chapter was literally designed to troll the player, just like Drakengard 3's scene when you find a map and Zero says they do not have time for a stupid fetch quest, just so you could get back to monotony 5 minutes later. And for the record, when I say even worse, I do not mean that I dislike those chapters, but right now I want to talk about why they are understandably off-putting. I promised a few times by now that I will talk about improvements, and of course, I do also want to keep that promise. And do not worry, I know it is pretty long, but we are almost done with a section of the video. Another problem with chapters like the 5th arc for many could be that this chapter is weirdly long. It has 2, what I consider exciting and important bosses, and the first half until you reach the boss is fine. You could possibly get more to do, but it is fine. Then eventually you get to beat the second boss and to run to the exit, which comes right after the second boss. And I can absolutely understand if someone considers that section as too long, especially as many of the areas start to look really repetitive. You see, the second half, which is the portion between the first and the second boss, could very much start to feel too long and too repetitive. And I can absolutely understand if someone feels that. Naturally, not everyone has a problem with that, but admittedly, even I, the last time I got through that section, avoided a good amount of battles and treasure chests because I just wanted this chapter to end, since, except for the areas looking cool in my opinion, there was nothing that really had me thinking that I should stay there. So the length of a chapter absolutely can feel too dragged out, when there is not really anything that makes you feel worth it. I think this chapter even more shows that it does not always matter if there is a literal restriction in space to move or not, when you cannot do much else anyway. The Sunleth waterscape is also one candidate for that. It is what I would call a visually very pleasing area. But despite it being a cliché RPG forest and lake area, you cannot do something. And no, I have not forgotten about the weather change mechanic. I mean beyond that, for such an area that is normally predestined to serve for exploration and interaction. This is also a quirk of mine, but I do not like it when RPGs have literal chapters. When you read a guide or whatever, that is perfectly fine to me, but always having a clear distinction between when a story section is over in an actual manner beyond leaving an area or the likes, it feels a lot more disjointed to me. Unfortunately, many Final Fantasies do that by now, and while it is not a no-go for me, I would choose to rather not have it, if I had the choice. And yes, there is some irony behind that, considering we have literally reached the end of this chapter of the video. The ways to improve Final Fantasy XIII in such a way it would not have lost much of what it ended up to be anyway, when it comes to the really relevant parts, while providing some more aspects and elements that could have turned out to be more exciting, are almost embarrassingly obvious. I will give you a few examples, but naturally there are by far more possibilities. For a start, the game could have been a lot different with just random encounters. You immediately lose one visual element telling you where to go, and as a matter of fact, this old school style of RPG enemy encounters itself also gives you a sense of individuality and unpredictability. Now, of course, RNG battles are not truly unpredictable, since it is actually pseudo-RNG, but that does not actually matter in the context of someone just playing while not knowing anything about the inner mechanics. At the same time, it would have helped actually giving the player a reason to stay. It is not like enemies in 13 did not respawn, but especially early on it seems fairly unusual to trigger that. Here you ignore that problem all along, and at the same time give the player the possibility to run around, not knowing what lurks next. That alone could have been done in several ways. I think losing the option to have visible enemies is a bit unfortunate, so maybe for pulse or bigger areas in general there could have been visible ones, but the mix of such style might have been weird, so they could have also gone for the option that its sequels went for, and have enemies spawn occasionally. Then you would most likely lose out on the way of presenting a surprising battle where you suddenly are drawn into the battle dimension, but it would still not take away from the surprise of a battle completely. Although, I would suggest this should not have been implemented as in Crisis Core, for example, where hugging the wall would lead to you possibly avoiding many battles, and instead would have flagged just bigger zones overall. For the sake of a more solid surprise, where you are from one moment to the next one, and in old school style drawn into battle without the necessity of contact with the enemy, I think invisible enemies and the sudden pull into battle would work better. But you need to keep in mind that you lose some of the more realistic touch if you really see nothing, and this leads to moments where, for example on Pulse, you would not be able to observe the wildlife properly. Here I could imagine something that is also very reminiscent of Lightning Returns. Just already place a few enemies early on and let additional ones spawn later. For the more narrow paths, they could have let more of the pseudo-randomly spawned enemies spawn, while reducing some of the visible ones and show them in more meaningful places instead. I think such a combo could have worked. You would still sacrifice the random pull into the battle zone out of nowhere, but I still think either just the random zone shift or a mix like I explained it would have been better options. I cannot see how unifying the two would have worked out any better. Now, if you do not just have visible enemies alone, you have the disadvantage that 13 did not have, as of course since you knew exactly what you would get, you could use that. But even with my combo idea, you could have done that for several visible enemies, and when it comes to the flagged zones where enemies spawn, some might be aware that there are such in Final Fantasies from before, with a higher encounter rate or some zones that actually only contain one specific type of enemy. So I think that would not have been too much of a problem. I'm also not inherently against the idea of visible enemies in areas, as around that time Nier Gestalt, Nier Replicant and Star Ocean 4 The Last Hope were released, and they also had bigger areas with enemies. And for the record, I love those games. I also do not think it matters too much for many people when it comes to Pulse, but since I want to share some ideas that do not immediately require the early level design to give up all of its linearity, those are some of my suggestions, as they immediately give the player more of what I call the illusion of freedom. Now when it comes to giving the player more to do, it is almost a reason to cry, because this game so often provides you with reasons for why you should be able to do something, but it just does not go any further. It is basically what I said about the Nautilus earlier, and even if it is not actually necessary, it does not really disrupt the game's flow too much. I promised that for all the praise about the realism and organic inclusion of certain elements, I would also point out the limits, and here I will mention them. Final Fantasy XIII does a very good job of introducing you to a meaningful world. When it comes to why you cannot visit something, do something, or talk to someone, you always have the argument of how the Xiii have a mission, they're actually escaping, people fear them, and that the overall story is the primary focus. That all makes sense, but it does not mean that you cannot have some leeway. Especially as the very fact that you were able to go back to Pulse later, and you also can do Cie'th missions, use your Chocobo or visit Mount Yashas, shows already that the game more than clearly has no problem of not just restricting you to the characters' stories alone. So there would have been no harm in giving you a teeny tiny bit more leeway, and with it some more options. You still can have the story be the focus. You do not really need to abandon the game's idea of what is the most important thing. As a matter of fact, many of the things that you can do, or possibly could do, very well have actual meaning, or could be reasonably implemented into the character's ordinary behavior. As much as I praised the creativity of how unusual yet fitting the design of save points, treasure chests and the likes was, at the same time it also might seem a bit weird to see some of them on Pulse. While things from Cocoon originate from Pulse, much of it still looks more advanced, since it is not like Cocoon itself does not invent its own new things. The treasure chests on Pulse maybe just needed a slightly different design. The terminals, however, can seem a bit too much without a proper story for them. I do not think that it is an impossible task to solve, and I want to present two solutions for it that I think of as quite fitting, quite appropriate. First of all, the terminals could have been used like the save points in Final Fantasy X and provided you with possibilities to spend your time differently. It is a terminal, so opening something like a virtual card game program would have been very fitting, or, well, something very similar to that. Doesn't really matter, but card games like Triple Triad or Tetramaster, we know all of those mini games, so I think it would have been quite a fitting solution that many people would have cherished. Why have a terminal that can give you access to, let's just call it eBay, Amazon, and all those other shopping options, but not even give the simplest gaming option? Doing it the same way as Final Fantasy X, but with a more logical system, and with it giving you the option to do something if there is any need for a breather for 5 minutes, could have made a big difference already. And you cannot actually tell me they have this computer system and in-universe they exist only for the purpose that we see. There are even characters who could introduce you to it easily. At first I thought about either Hope or Vanille, but given the situation with Hope and his mother, it would have been unfitting, and Vanille just woke up a few days ago. I think Sazh is the one who suddenly, in one of the early chapters, should introduce you to the game. While Sazh is also in a tough situation, they could tell us how it reminds him of his son, and how he taught him how to play the game. It would also fit the fact that later in 13.2, you get a little hint of Sazh having been in Xanadu or Serendipity or whatever you know the casino as. Sazh definitely is believable as a more playful guy, especially considering he has a child. To solve the question of the terminals themselves, they could have given us a proper reason of the save points being there, and that could be something like the government once having placed more unusually located save points to oversee the Xiii and watch their steps. We see Bartendalis's Owl Minerva anyway sometimes. They could have also used the save points in a scene and then show us how they were tracked, and then suddenly would have been ambushed. And they would have to fight or to flee or whatever, doesn't really matter. And after that, one of the characters, possibly Sazh as well, would need to find a way to reconfigure the terminals so they could no longer be tracked, and there would be an excuse for why the characters still would use the save points. As said before, those are just some possibilities. But you could include minigames, and you could actually provide some more actual in-universe lore here. You could make things even more logical, even more organic, and also make it more fun for the individual player. Now, the next game is something that is almost a cliche in many role-playing games, and it is fishing. That is also something that could have been introduced by SAS for the same reason, or, call me crazy, maybe Vanille. Because, well, it is not like she's the character in universe who uses something like a freaking fishing rod as a weapon. Of course, you probably already know what I'm alluding to, especially considering there is a scene where she literally catches one of those weird dragon things with her staff. Maybe they could have given us both characters to go fish with different methods, and later on even all of them. I'm just suggesting a few things here of how things could get more exciting, and you would possibly be able to land a fish or some other creature only with a certain character. They could even go so far to make Vanille's fishing depend on the upgrades of her weapons, so if it is in the final tier, if it has reached a certain level, etc. And I don't think I need to mention that there are enough bodies of water in Cie'th, even the 5th arc, and on Pulse. Of course it would require you to be able to go back to certain areas, but that should be an option anyway, and for that they could have also added more and new enemies after the monsters of Cocoon were summoned to Eden. Now you could just find them everywhere. For the question of when the minigame or side quest could have been introduced, I think particularly the Cie'th Waterscape chapter with SAS and Vanille would have been perfect. You are a few hours into the game, the characters are fitting ones, and the location with its all-naturey setting would have been perfect. For Cie'th, you could have even added an additional layer with a weather mechanic and make that influence the fishing as well. I think there are many fishing minigames that end up being really dull, even those for which you can do a lot of things, but I think the way this could have been implemented already would have made for a very promising task and a very promising side quest slash minigame that could actually make you waste a few hours and excite the player. Another thing that I cannot believe to not have been included, even though it is almost self-explanatory, is the option to have some racings. You have chocobos and summons that literally can turn into vehicles. It might have been a bit hard to think of something for Alexander and for Bahamut, and it would have asked for exceptional handling, but having a chocobo, a horse, a motorcycle, racing car, and Vanille's weird Hekatonkyr Magitek armor would really give you various interesting racing options. If it seems a bit too sacrilegious to use the summons for that, you could still just implement the chocobos, but I think the game would have been missing out on an actually obvious option then. Well, of course it already did, but we are speaking about a scenario where the game itself was at least implementing the option to have some racing minigame itself. Regarding chocobos, we actually have a short side quest, but I think being a bit more creative here and maybe even having the option to have the chocobos somewhere different on Pulse and digging up treasure there as well, so several ideas of making the minigame something you can do more with, is not out of the realm of possibility. Next, of course, and how could I not talk about it, we have the Cie'th missions. There are 64 of them. Even when it comes to that, Final Fantasy XIII kind of trolls you by acknowledging that you did not have much to do first, because the first stone is right at the beginning of Arkilti and you literally get a scene thrown at you telling you what all of this is about. I think the missions are not inherently a bad idea. But first of all, I would have some voiceover for the missions to get a better feeling about what those stones and challenges actually are about with all the text that exists for it. Also, 64 of them are actually very much, and many of them are very generic, so you could possibly cut down the amount of missions to a half of the original count, with it only featuring the more special enemies like Neochu, Tumbery, Vercingetorix, etc. And maybe have some other challenges for the Cie'th missions that do not amount to just having a normal battle, but for example, as there already is a chocobo digging quest, dig up a very specific item and then bring it to a special place. Yes, of course, that is ultimately broken down to a fetch quest, but such things always succeed or fail based on the execution and the substance that you provide them with. It is not like you are a prince who is a people's man and therefore fetch some onions for a merchant. Well, so much for that. Fetch quests and hunts in their ordinary concept are the most generic ideas of all, but you can make them work if you just make them more exciting and do not make them feel so insignificant. It is not like other side quests people can do, exclude battles or getting items completely anyway. You would be surprised how often that is the case, even if they do not at first just look like the average Joe of the type of quest. And of course you could go even further and then go to fish a very specific fish, who then maybe even turns out to be an enemy you have to fight for the challenge. In this case you would combine even more elements of the game, the Cie'th missions, fishing and fighting. Overall, I think the missions already had some very good rewards with some of their items and the fact that you could unlock fast traveling, but there was and still is definitely something that could improve or could have improved the overall quality of them and give you a better reason to actually go back to them. Repetitiveness, as formerly mentioned, is nothing new, and I think most would agree that catching 10 of each monster in Final Fantasy X was also not the most original idea, but there was the overall concept of you basically walking around everywhere again, therefore going on another exploration tour, and then you did that to unlock more battles and get some more new rewards which would help you for your equipment, and that was a very high motivator. Also, of course, it awoke a sense of completionism in people to actually have everything. This sense can be awoken with the Cie'th missions as well, and of course also in the way they are, especially as it was the first real Final Fantasy that even rewarded you with trophies, which by the way could also have been more for even different quests and challenges according to the tasks you would be able to fulfill, and yet I stand by my argument that they could have done more with it. Final Fantasy X is known for its very fluctuating quality of minigames and side quests, but there was still enough variety to keep you hooked, despite having weird little things like dodging lightning strikes or butterfly catching, but maybe people actually liked that, who knows. Now to tackle the subject of the Crystarium. The Crystarium is a lot more simplistic and people hated that, which I actually have not even mentioned up until now, but while I get how it also stands for the linearity and gives off no real vibes of individuality, I do not think the system itself would have needed a different approach. If you think about it, it is not really different from the sphere grid itself. In 10, you would normally just go different routes with each character, but ultimately, if you're really bothered, you would still end up with the same thing, and 13 was not really different. The characters all started out with different strengths, and then later could unlock everything on their own trees. And even then they ended up a lot more different than the characters in 10, so I would say that despite the unfortunate visual restrictions, the characters of 13 were a lot luckier. That being said, a bit greater trees and a few more branches without changing the system fundamentally would not have caused any harm. When I played the game, I praised the later portions so much, and I also mentioned in a forum that we would actually end up fighting the Fal'Cie Titan. There were the missions, there were the Titan trials, and there was this giant Fal'Cie plastered directly in front of you. Never would have imagined that when I told people this would turn out to be the super boss, to actually have told them nonsense. This was a big letdown for people, and that affected the development so much that they added Atlas in 13 too, who we could fight them. But that was the false Fal'Cie, and it was one game too late. Having this guy in something called the Titan Trials should have been enough of a setup to fight him as super boss in the end, instead of some throwaway Vercingetorix boss. Not that they needed to scrap that one, but I think a Titan is more worthy of being a successor to Yasmat, Penance, Ozma, Omega Weapon, Ruby Weapon, and all the other freaks. At least we got one type of giant, overpowered monster with the dragon turtles. But well, I still am disappointed that we never got to fight the big guy. And obviously, there always is the possibility of presenting the player some optional areas or dungeons. Mount Yashas basically was that already. The characters visited the area during the story, as you could see Lightning and the others when you arrived on Pulse, standing on the Padra ruins, but that only happened very quickly in a cutscene, and then later you can visit the area if you want, as it actually is an optional area. But when it comes to scenes, not much is going on there, except for some scene on one cliff. It is nice that you can visit the area, but again, you cannot really do much there except for some battles and collect some treasure chests. The ruins are the battleground for you and Vercingetorix, but why even have ruins and then not give the player the opportunity to explore more of them, as either dungeons, or one dungeon at least, or show that they lead to a dungeon. You could do so much to explore the ancient civilization while once more presenting something as common for an RPG element as an extra dungeon. There should definitely have been more to do with the ruins, if you ask me. The same goes for Erba, or Orba. Yes, I understand the atmosphere is supposed to be depressing, but you do not need to give that up. As many things that I already talked about, these things are not mutually exclusive. You could also have a lot more to do in Erba and use Vanille, Fang, and maybe the pet robot Bhakti for that. You might also remember that there was a little side quest about repairing Bhakti, but I really mean more and something that is a bit more spectacular. Not being able to do much, and not actually getting to know much, even though you could have done both, is even more depressing than it was surely intended. In case of something like the ruins, a story-related exception, and show a handful of survivors that also could give you some insight, which basically gives you another option of having some sort of smaller village to visit, and maybe therefore even something like a secret merchant that you cannot access with a terminal, making the place even more special as you can actually stay there and talk to people in a way it was normally not really possible over the course of the game for real. In Final Fantasy XIII 2, we even met Yule, who is from Padra, so it is not like they shied away from bringing up new people who settled in such areas. Giving you a few people to talk to, or a bit more to do in Erba, some more scenes there, a few more themes on Mount Yashas, those are demands that are not out of the ordinary for an RPG. Relatively easy to pull off, and would have added enough elements to the game to feel like something that actually belongs there as an organic part of it. Yes, it is super depressing that you travel to Erba, what feels like the end of the world, where you literally stop at the end of the road, the train tracks, and you just feel the sadness about it being a dead village. But you probably also feel the sadness that, except for some Cie'th missions and a robot that is just there to give you a trophy, a gold trophy later, the treasure hunter gold trophy, you cannot really do anything here. Isn't that sad as well? I would say it is. And you could have done so much more, really. But I have to give credit where credit is due, because the Dead Civilization vibes are perfectly provided. I just think that could have been done with a bit more additional, let's just call it spice. Just like areas like the Nautilus Park, as I said, absolutely could have given you more things to do, or some way to return to Palimpolum later, and then visit some stores there, considering the fact that I said they could have added monsters everywhere, so you could easily return to that area and maybe gone to visit some buildings that were abandoned. I believe I have made myself clear that there are so many ways to add more to such a game and make it fit the game itself. Overall, I think that there should have been more areas in Pulse, obviously. I do not need to explore the entire planet, but having an impressive scene during the arrival on Pulse, and also when you actually leave it, and when you get to see its landscape, might awake the wish to see more. I hate it when what is considered open world today is in a game just for the sake of it. Especially when there is no substance to it as well as I do not like that this is such a big selling point nowadays, but adding a few more areas on Pulse does not require for the world to be really open world. Though by today's standards, it probably would have been called that, because for some it is already enough to have some wide spaces to call it open world, which is, dare I say, a ridiculous way to see it. Anyway, Final Fantasy XIII is so rich in its lore that there could have been enough substance attached to additional areas. Overall, I do not understand why Final Fantasy XIII, which came out when DLCs got popular, never got some DLC. I think this could have actually solved a few things for some, and then later on there could have been a complete edition including the DLC. So even if they did not succeed in bringing in a few more exciting elements for the player at first, some DLCs still could have helped them raise the popularity of their game. Of course, DLC is also a very risky topic, but that is a different story. So, as it can clearly be seen, this game could have given you so many more options to win the more skeptic part of the fanbase over. Even for the more complex story, they could have given us something that made it possible to watch the cutscenes again. Surely they could have found a fitting reason for that as well. In general, I would really wish that, should they ever bring out a remaster of the trilogy, the first Final Fantasy XIII gets a bit reworked and a bit richer with some ideas. I also do not understand why areas like Lightning's house were cut from the game, as such things often are very interesting for the fanbase. As said, give the people more to do. But also make it meaningful and not just be there because you're afraid of fan criticism or the game will reek of that, just like 15 did. You might have noticed that I mentioned 15 a few times by now. Do not get me wrong, I do not hate Final Fantasy 15. I just think it was approached completely wrong, and while Versus 13 always was supposed to be something a bit less restrictive than 13, you could absolutely see in the first chapters of the game that this is the way it is because there was so much backlash. I just wish it was handled better. But this is not a video about 15 per se, so let's just leave it at that. Just as 13, this game also had a lot of good things and could use some improvements. If you want to post some more ideas, feel free to do so. So now you've reached the end of the video. There was lots of criticism, and also there were lots of ideas of how it could have been different. But I believe in between it was also very well noticeable how much I love Final Fantasy XIII. The very existence of this video alone is based on my love for this game and the overall trilogy. If you hate Final Fantasy XIII, I will probably not be able to change that. And that is okay. My first 30 minutes of this video should have made it very clear that I just do not believe in every hate of that game to be of equal basis and legitimacy. Just as people can love something because they with all their might have established a mindset that let them turn a blind eye to anything, and in both cases it is even possible that they do not even understand the product they consumed. I just wanted to make this video because, as mentioned before, as much as I love Final Fantasy XIII, I think it was always treated in an unfair manner, and at the same time, while showing what it truly means to me, I wanted to talk about how the game might have turned out to be a better version of itself for many. If you have not experienced Final Fantasy XIII yet, and want to do so, or think you might give it another chance, or you even thought about it again more in depth, and this video helped in any way to contribute to that, then I consider myself glad that I actually was of any help. Final Fantasy XIII is one of the actually many black sheep of this franchise, but it has gotten a very strong fanbase that really praise it, and many over the years also said, thinking about it now, the game actually is very pretty, and not too bad. So it is not like it is a child in a corner surrounded by just bullies, and yet it will always have that stigma that the other mentioned Final Fantasies also somewhat have. So, Spirits Within, Crystal Chronicles, etc. So in a sense I think it is still vastly underrated. Everyone should at least have given it one complete try unless they really and absolutely feel they just cannot bring themselves to finish this game, because of course you should also not force yourself to waste the limited time you have. But I personally can and always will recommend it, as Final Fantasy XIII gives you a world, characters and overall composition of game elements that may reward you with feelings that you might very well know from other Final Fantasies. In my case, I only ever felt more for one Final Fantasy, and as said, that is Final Fantasy VII. It even took away the place of 6 and 9 for me, who formerly shared the second place, and I think many of us can agree that those are also fantastic games. Terra, Zidane, Garnet, Kuja, Kefka, they're all great, despite all that negativity. Final Fantasy XIII will always be the first main numbered entry that I played while learning Japanese, and it will always be one of the products that I fell in love with while watching the trailers. For me, it will always stay the game for which I got a letter around Christmas that it was waiting for me to be picked up at the custom office, making me really mad because that meant I had to wait 3 more days, serving as a big screw you for Christmas in my case. There are people who make short videos about every game with a short summary of the story, saying it is good or bad, mentioning how good the characters and the world building are and how incredible the music might have been. And while also talking about these things, even though I hardly talked about the story at all, or about too much of the soundtrack, I wanted this video to be something more solid, and hopefully also interesting to some as I approached both sides. I can only say Final Fantasy XIII means so much to me, and having been rewarded as a fan with more content of it through the sequels, despite them of course also not being perfect for me, I am still and will always be very grateful that Square made such games for me. With this being said, thank you for watching.
alive.